There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on. Hello and welcome to Mamamia Out Loud, what women are actually talking about on Monday, the 11th of September. I'm Holly Wainwright.
I'm Mia Freedman.
And I'm Clare Stevens.
And on the show today, a convicted rapist and two of the most famous people in the world. Why everyone is talking about Danny Masterson, Ashton Kutcher and Mila Kunis. Also, a cry for help from a lonely generation or the cost of being a Nicole. We're unpacking a viral clip about friendship rejection. And seeing the human side of people you vehemently disagree with, is it always a good idea? Annabelle Crabb has thoughts. But first, Mia.
In case you missed it, Rihanna and her partner ASAP Rocky.
No, it's ASAP Rocky and Mia. You just sounded 100.
You pronounce it ASAP.
ASAP Rocky. Never, ever say that ever again.
But sometimes I say, like, can you get that for me ASAP? Well, all of this is quite apt because in case you missed it, Rihanna and Rocky have had another baby, another little boy, and they've called him Riot, and I think that's silly.
Riot.
I do. Because also Elon Musk this week announced the birth of his third child with his ex-partner who's called Grimes. I just can't with people's names anymore. That little boy is called Techno Mechanicus. Or Tau for short. Elon's and Grimes' first son is called... it's just a whole lot of symbols, like a password that's generated for you. And their daughter's name is also another one that's like a password, except it's more like Exodark Musk. And Rihanna and ASAP Rocky, their first baby is called RZA. And I think you pronounce that, Reza, and I can't even deal. And I've decided that baby names are the new tattoos and everyone has to just calm down.
As somebody who is a child of teachers, we have often talked about naughty names that always mean that you're going to have a naughty kid. All of these are naughty
names.
For example, I think a Blake is always going to, I'm not saying they're a bad person. I'm just saying a Blake is always going to be just a little bit naughty.
I went to school with a naughty Blake.
Yeah, they're just always going to be a little bit naughty. You cannot tell me that Riot is going to be a well-behaved child who sits quietly.
I just think
it's
babies' names have become, I mean, they always have been branding for parents, really, because when you have to choose a name for your child, it is a reflection of you.
None of your kids are called Bob and John.
No,
your
I
kids
agree
have
with
all
you.
got interesting
it's
names.
All branding in a way. But
did
now,
you see it that way, do you think?
I think everyone does. And I think that now the idea is that your name of your child has to be very extra special. And that's why we've now seen this proliferation of companies like one called Nom de Bloom Naming, where you actually pay for a bespoke list of first and middle names. You give them a briefing of whatever criteria it is you're looking for, like maybe you want a name that is based on your mother's name or that matches the vibe of the baby's older sibling, or maybe you just want one that's outside of the top 500 or even 1,000 most common baby names. And then for a whole lot of money, they come back with a list of possible names.
There's only one test you need, and this was my life growing up in Manchester. We used to play in the street. Remember when the kids used to play in the street? You have to test every name by what it would sound like if you were yelling it out in the street. And so you were going, Riot, it's time for your bath.
Yes.
And it's like, that's not going to work. See, that's what people now do with their dogs. They yell it and imagine yelling it at the park.
Yes.
And so you go, Caesar. Yeah, nah, still love him.
There's one story dominating this week, and it's about Danny Masterson, a Hollywood actor who has been convicted of rape, and about Ashton Kutcher and Mila Kunis, two of his very famous friends who wrote Masterson glowing character references to try to minimise his sentence, which, after 2 trials on these charges, has turned out to be 30 years. Now, Claire, this story takes a lot of turns, so for those of us who are not that familiar with the show that all 3 of these people were on, and I believe the sort of genesis of their fame, that 70s show. Who the hell is Danny Masterson?
That 70s show is the show that I grew up watching.
Is it kind of like Everybody Loves Raymond or something like that?
Yeah.
My era?
Yes. Like
harmless sitcom.
Exactly. I have seen every single episode of it. And Danny Masterson in that was like the stoner.
I don't love people.
I love Camaros, Zeppelin, and French fries in that order.
So Ashton Kutcher and Mila Kunis played sort of a on-again, off-again couple.
Danny Masterson is not like a household name. So he hasn't done much since then, right? Unlike Ashton and Mila.
He was doing a show a few years ago with Ashton Kutcher, and as soon as these allegations came out, they kicked him off the show.
Right.
He's a Scientologist, quite a prominent Scientologist.
Yeah.
What has he been convicted of? What did he do?
He has been convicted of 2 counts of rape. And there are more accusers. So there is, in particular, an ex-partner who accused him of rape. There was not enough evidence. She's probably the person people have seen in the media talking about the case and talking about him, but he has not been found guilty of her allegations in a court of law.
But he has been found guilty of 2 other women whose victim statements did get read out in the court of law, and they are really shocking. So Mila Kunis and Ashton Kutcher wrote character references for Masterson, right? He was found guilty, then there's a pause, then they're going to get sentenced. And so they've written him these quite glowing character references about what a great guy he was. And unsurprisingly, the internet was not thrilled, and there has been a big pushback. And so this weekend, Mila and Ashton released an apology video. Here's a little bit of what they said.
We are aware of the pain that has been caused by the character letters that we wrote on behalf of Danny Masterson.
We support victims. We have done this historically through our work and will continue to do so in the future. The letters were not written to question the legitimacy of the judicial system or the validity of the jury's ruling.
They were intended for the judge to read and not to undermine the testimony of the victims or re-traumatize them in any way. We would never want to do that. And we're sorry if that has taken place.
Our heart goes out to every single person who's ever been a victim of sexual assault, sexual abuse, or rape.
Why would Mila Kunis and Ashton Kutcher do this? Why would they write those references? Why does it matter what they think about Danny Masterson?
It's a pretty common occurrence to have character references when someone is awaiting sentencing or consideration of a judge. In Australia as well, would I write a character reference for someone who is charged with a sexual assault? I don't think I would. The idea is basically so the judge gets a contextual picture of the accused or the person who's been convicted before they sentence them to work out, well, are they a repeat offender? Do they do good things in the community? Have they never had a history of any transgression before? And they're meant to take that into consideration. Now, I think there were about 50 character references for Danny Masterson. And I don't know whether character references are always public in a case or whether these just became public after his conviction. But obviously, people are very upset, particularly because Ashton Kutcher has a charity that helps to combat sex slavery.
Yes, so sexual abuse in the context of human trafficking. And it's been something we've talked about a lot in Australia because people probably remember when George Pell was being sentenced that Tony Abbott was a character reference and a few very high-profile Australian figures were character references, and people felt incredibly uncomfortable about it because there is something very different. There is something that feels really different about reading a character reference when it is in the context of a case about child sexual abuse or rape.
As opposed to
drink driving. Like, obviously, you could argue that a person doing drink driving also doesn't deserve that context, but the reason it feels so jarring is because often it's just after an entire court case that has questioned the victim. Because in a sexual assault case, it's different to any other case because the victim is the evidence in a bizarre way, and the victim and their integrity has to be questioned in order to defend the alleged perpetrator.
It would seem that, particularly in this kind of assault, like they're irrelevant. It is possible to be a good friend and, appear to be a good friend, a good dude who does whatever. It's possible to be those things and still be a rapist. There's no way you could possibly know whether or not that guy was guilty of these things.
Which is what they maintain, that they were just talking about him within that time frame and the person that they knew, and that they weren't questioning the judicial system or the validity of the victim stories. I've written a character reference for someone who was charged with a first-time low-range DUI, and I did not in any way try to make excuses for them. In fact, the opposite. And I didn't try to defend their actions or, question whether they did it or not. That's not the role of a character reference. But even all of that aside, you would say they must have been really, really close friends to have done that, because anyone could have seen that that was not going to go well for Ashton Kutcher and Mila Kunis when this came out.
No, and the biggest thing people say is that these sorts of character references are re-traumatizing to victims. They've just been through this horrible court case, and then you hear Ashton Kutcher say, I do not believe he is an ongoing harm to society, and having his daughter raised without a present father would be a tertiary injustice in and of itself.
Is that what the character reference said?
They were his words.
Like, how would he know whether he's an ongoing harm to society?
Exactly. It feels so
that's
bizarre.
terrible.
So it seems that the judge also kind of thought this was irrelevant, because 30 years is a very serious sentence for sexual assault. And in America, sexual assault jail sentences are stricter than here. So they say the average one for a convicted rape will be about 14 years, which is a long time, happily, in a way, because here in Australia, the equivalent is around 4 years. But still, 30 years is a really long time, which suggests that the victim's testimony was incredibly compelling. They've said that obviously the crimes themselves were terrible, but then they were also then subject to intimidation and silencing from people.
Because they were Scientologists as well, weren't they?
Yeah, from people within the Church of Scientology. The Church of Scientology very vehemently denies that, of course. The fact that the sentence was so serious suggests that the judge also didn't really give a stuff about Ashton and Mila's character reference or any of the other 48 that were there. So again, why all this glare on them?
There's the hypocrisy element that people are looking at somebody like Ashton Kutcher, who has done so much public-facing work about victims of abuse, and then doesn't seem to have empathy for a victim of abuse when it happens to have been perpetrated by his friend. There's that element. There's also the stark nature of these character references. There's another part where Ashton Kutcher says Masterson helped him not fall into the typical Hollywood life of drugs. Whereas we know, and Ashton Kutcher knew at the time of writing that Danny Masterson drugged his victims. So it's like, oh, okay, cool. So he wasn't taking drugs and he helped his friends not take drugs, but he was using drugs in order to commit these offences. So it does seem as though Ashton Kutcher and Mila Kunis, by extension, are these people who really put out this image of caring about victims, but it's very different when it's close to them and their circle.
My first reaction when I was looking at this and how all of the oxygen is being sucked up by them is that must also be very infuriating for the victims, because really our focus should be on Danny Masterson and the victims, right? Unless the thing I was thinking is, I guess it's justified that every headline I'm reading is about Ashton and Mila if what we're suggesting is that this kind of cronyism and, powerful people looking after their own is part of the problem. You know what I mean? Like in a Me Too sense. In the same way that we discussed how Robert Downey Jr. was paying for Armie Hammer's rehab, or, that celebrity circle will close in and protect its own, which is never going to be good for people from the outside who are trying to get justice. But is it that, or is it just tantalizing because they're famous?
What's happened recently is that one of Masterson's accusers, his ex, Chrissy Carnell-Bixler, shared a number of old clips and accusations on social media about Ashton Kutcher specifically. And she wrote on her Instagram stories, "Dear Ashton, I know the secrets your role model keeps for you, ones that would end you. Did you forget I was there? You were on speakerphone the night that Danny called on February 21, 2001. So she's shared that, and it has been in the news, and people have asked what the hell happened on February 21, 2001. Now, for context, this has been in the news for a long time that a woman that Ashton Kutcher was dating was murdered in February 2001. The man who murdered her is in prison. We definitely know who did it. His name is Michael Gargiulo. He's known as the Hollywood Ripper. There is irrefutable evidence that he is the one who murdered Ashley Ellerin, who was the woman Ashton Kutcher was seeing. But this has now been brought up by one of Masterson's accusers as though there's maybe something we don't know about this story. It's a very dangerous territory to go down. But I'm sure a lot of people are now really reading about that Ashton Kutcher case and doing it with a very different lens, which is a dangerous thing to
speculate about.
That feels kind of gross. It feels like Ashton Kutcher's in the headlines for what's clearly a misguided and, depending on your perspective, like downright traumatizing act. And so let's trawl through everything that's ever happened to Ashton Kutcher and point out all the ways in which he's problematic, which is something that we like to do on the internet. But is that really fair? I mean, I don't know. I don't want to make in any way sound like I'm defending the undefendable, but it also feels a little bit like a feeding frenzy at this point, don't you think?
It does. It feels like the internet has turned on Ashton and Mila in a really vicious way. It always seems to be the case that in these stories, we get further and further away from the victims and the victims' experiences. We're now on to focusing far more on the two celebrity friends of Danny Masterson than the people that he hurt and the lives he ruined.
There was a video that went viral on TikTok last week that was quite extraordinary to watch. It was by a young woman called Jada, and she basically broke down in tears in her car and shared about how exhausted she was feeling about being rejected as a friend. Here's some of what she said.
I am so tired of begging people to want me in their life. Like, I don't understand. I don't understand. I am trying so hard. I've been trying so hard for so long to connect with people. And I'm trying to just love without any strings attached, not expect anything in return. But it's so tiring to always be the one reaching out, trying to make plans, just trying to get any sort of interest from people. I don't understand. I do not understand.
This is such a 2023 thing because she's being so genuine and she's so clearly distressed. But then there's also the music that she's put underneath it.
And also the fact that she is doing it to the camera in the front of her car.
Yeah, and I do think that I'll defend that in some way because it's like when you are feeling incredibly lonely and isolated and like you're the crazy one, saying that and being reassured by strangers can actually be quite comforting. I don't know how sustainable it is long term as a solution. But
do you think that that's the motive for the video is the validation of strangers? It wasn't to get at somebody in particular who's let her down?
That's interesting. I didn't see it as an attention seeking in that sense or a revenge.
I did think everybody who is friends with her would be thinking, oh, this is about me.
It's reached almost 7 million people now. And a lot of people commented, sort of sympathised and have said that they can relate because they have been in or are currently in a similar situation with people who don't value their friendships. It's kind of like that trope of he's just not that into you, but in a friendship sense, not a romantic one. You know, there's several surprising parts of this. And one of them is that, you know, she seems from the outside like the kind of person who would not have problems being socially connected. She's young and she's beautiful, but we know that actually Gen Z women are the loneliest demographic of all. And it's no coincidence that they have been raised in the internet era of social media. And we know what damage that has done. We're only really understanding that now. We reached out to Rebecca Sparrow, who is an outlouder, also a bit of an expert in this area of friendship and young women. And she wrote a great article about it for Mamamia with some advice and some tips for people who might be struggling with it, because you might see that and not be able to relate to it yourself, but maybe your daughter, maybe your friend, maybe your cousin, maybe someone in your life has experienced that or is experiencing that. She said that some of the things to ask yourself are these really your people? When you're trying to sort of insert yourself into groups of people that don't seem to want you, should you be looking elsewhere? She also says something that's really interesting, Hol. I want to ask you about this. She says, are you looking for more intensity than what your friends can give? Are you being needy? She says there's a fine line between enthusiasm and smothering people. Ask yourself if you're comfortable being alone in your company. If you're not, it could make you quite needy as a friend, needing others to entertain you and prop you up.
When I read Beck's article, I found it really helpful and informative, but there was also a bit of me that was like, oh, it's kind of brave, because in this climate these days, people would be like, oh, that's a bit victim blamey. Like, what do you mean she's needy? She's a poor, distressed young woman. But Beck is so right and wise in this explanation, because it's not about saying to her there's something wrong with you. But one of the things that can happen in friendships and families is that needs clash, like if your needs don't meet. So some people need more social connection than others. Some people need to feel like there are more people around them than others. And if you're clashing with people in your life because they don't seem to be giving you what you need, it might be because they already have it, but it also might just be because they don't need it in the same way that you do. You know, it's interesting. We say everybody has to learn to be comfortable by themselves, but not everybody can. Again, we're all wired a bit differently, that some people really need to feel that web of connection literally around them all the time to be able to feel safe, and other people find it suffocating. So neither of those people are wrong or right or needy or whatever, but you've got to match yourself, which is what's really interesting in the way Beck puts it. And she's like, match your intensity with somebody else. Again, you can read that as critical, like a little bit like, oh, you're a bit much, aren't you? But actually what it means is find the people who need what you need, because it can be really easy to miscommunicate. You asking and reaching out to arrange this and do that can be overwhelming for someone who just does not need that in their lives.
So I've had to really re-examine my response to this video, because when I first saw it, I was frustrated and annoyed, and I couldn't work out why my response to somebody who is being incredibly vulnerable and incredibly open and crying was to be annoyed with them. And I'm listening to her saying, I'm so tired. And I just looked at her and felt angry. And it was because I think I get the sense that that emotion that she's putting out there, that's a lot to put on other people. I think sometimes we can be, vulnerable about, I feel like this about myself, or situations that you're not asking for anything from somebody else. But I think my visceral reaction of being annoyed by it was because
you felt pressure. So you automatically put yourself in the shoes of her friends and the people in her life and thought, oh my God, that's a lot of pressure to put on them. I didn't think of that.
And she's looking at the camera and looking at the people in her life and basically saying, I'm so tired and I put in so much work and this is what I want and I'm not getting it. Yeah, my initial reaction was to be annoyed by that.
So was your response more like, well, change it, like that's on you?
Yeah. And I actually feel horrible that was my response, because as you say, we know that Gen Z are the loneliest generation, and there are so many social issues that are contributing.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think Gen Z are so lonely?
Because they have replaced genuine social interaction with being on their phone.
With a phone.
I think I was even viscerally frustrated by the fact that she was whinging about it to her phone. And I'm like, your phone isn't going to fix the issue. Your phone is the issue.
But they don't know what to do. They've not grown up without one. They know no other way. So what are they meant to do? Like, they're not going to go and join a book club. They don't know how.
But there are things. There are things you can do. But once I put that frustration aside and I appreciated the fact that what she's talking about is incredibly valid, I then realised I was coming from a place of massive privilege, which is that I'm not the Nicole, I'm not the organiser in any of my friendship groups, and I am so lucky to be surrounded by people who take on that mental load.
So Nicole is shorthand for Outlouders who aren't aware. It's a brilliant comedy sketch by Geraldine Hickey a few years ago saying that every female friendship group has a Nicole, who's the person who books the restaurant, circulates the menu, reminds everybody what time we're getting there, all of those things.
My biggest fear with travel, though, is travelling in a group with no leader. It's when you need a Nicole to come in, right? Nicole comes in, she's like, righto, girls, this is what we're doing. Buffet finishes at 10, you want to get there before 9:30, that's when they stop cooking the pancakes, you want to get in on those pancakes, they're good pancakes. First shuttle bus leaves at 10:15 from the hotel. We're going to be on that bus for a morning of shopping.
In every social situation, there's someone who takes that role on. Now, often that person seems to revel in that role. Like a true born Nicole likes it because you get a lot of control that way, but also it can be entirely exhausting.
But you need appreciation and you need agreement. So, because if you're the Nicole that keeps trying to organise something and everyone's just like, I can't make it, that's really difficult and really painful because you do feel rejected.
But then I thought there's also something to really be said for that, and there's an empathy to have for that person. I think it's also, and I got the sense from this woman, when you are single and a lot of your friends are in relationships and they're getting their intimacy and they're getting their connection from something you can't be a part of, those people are great Nicoles because they genuinely want to have fun and they genuinely want to go out and spend time with girlfriends and that kind of thing. But that's kind of where the tension can come from, where people are in another life stage.
I loved the way Beck approached this because, like you, Hole, we're so used to going, oh, this poor woman, aren't her friends awful, or what's wrong with us as a society that young women are feeling like this, or that anyone can be lonely. You can't change how other people respond to you. All you can change is your own behaviour or your own expectations. So some of these questions that Beck suggested that you ask if you're in that situation, I get why it could be perceived as victim blaming, but it's not. It's actually proactive and helpful.
I also, when I watched it, thought social media has something else to answer for, which is not just the fact that it's made people lonelier, but it has really raised the expectations of what friendship is and what friendship looks like. So the amount of times I see girls going to lunch, and there are 18 girls going to lunch. And I think, how do you know that many people? How do you get a booking that big? Where did they come from? How do you have that many friends? How do you maintain
some of those lunches?
You've got friendship group.
18 is a lot. Like, I actually think it's an age thing that, like, I was not going to 18 people lunches when I was 25, but I think you gradually grow a bigger social network. But so I think even looking at something like weddings where people have 15 bridesmaids and you think, how do you have that many close people in your life? I think social media has set us up to have really superficial and unrealistic ideas of what friendship is. Is this woman's tears of disappointment that that's actually not the reality? That friendship is not as exciting as it looks on the internet, and friendship isn't as glamorous as it looks on the internet.
100%. But the other thing is we've kind of convinced ourselves you are socializing when you're doing it on your phone, and you're actually not. Like, you're really actually not. You know, if I've obviously got a young daughter and I talk to her about this all the time, is like seeing the difference in her demeanor when she does actually go and do something physical with her friends for a while.
Yes.
And how she is when she walks back in the house, and how she is, how her mood is, rather than spending 2 hours talking to all her friends, sure, on her phone, but just lying
alone
in
her room,
is absolutely stark. So the point earlier on, Mia, when you were like, this is the soup they've swum in their whole lives, they don't know any different. It's not going to change unless people do push themselves beyond that. Not to say that that is this woman's particular problem, but it's like we've tricked ourselves into thinking that those connections are the same, and they're not. They're not the same.
If you want to make Mamamia out loud part of your routine 5 days a week, we release segments on Tuesdays and Thursdays just for Mamamia subscribers. To get full access, follow the link in the show notes, and a big thank you to all our current subscribers. There's currently a big conversation going on about the ABC's Kitchen Cabinet, hosted by Annabelle Crabb, a half-hour show where Crabb, who's a political journalist, author and commentator, shares a home-cooked meal with one of federal Parliament's most powerful figures from across the political spectrum. This season, she has literally and metaphorically broken bread with Tahli, Linda Burney, Lydia Thorpe and Peter Dutton. It's the Peter Dutton episode of the show that has got a lot of people talking.
It's worth noting, though, you know, that those four people, and this is not an accident, one's an independent, one's a former Green, so actually two are independents, and one's a Lib and one's Labour. They couldn't have been more representative in their first 4 episodes.
Exactly, and that is highly intentional. When it was released 3 weeks ago, the Peter Dutton episode, there was a strong camp that said it wasn't right to humanise a person like Dutton, who is the current leader of the opposition. Journalist Jan Fran wrote on Instagram about the episode, essentially, who cares? She said, this, after all, is a man who walked out of the apology to the stolen generations, who voted no on same-sex marriage, who in 2016 said bringing Lebanese people to Australia was a mistake, whose department tried in 2017 to stop a suicidal 10-year-old boy from seeking treatment in Australia. And she says, forgive me, but who gives a fuck whether or not he appreciates an enormous fig tree that grows on his enormous property?
This tree is unbelievable.
It's about 30 paces around and I'd say, 200 years old, but pretty incredible.
Wow. It's a fig, right? Like
It
it's
is,
a giant fig.
But I was shocked by the part in her opinion post where she said all politicians are lizard ghouls who live in the bin.
Yes, she said it might be better to just assume that every single one of them is an infernal lizard ghoul who lives in a bin and go from there. From reading all the context, what she was saying is that's Peter Dutton, and therefore we should approach all politicians with that level of scepticism and that level of rigour.
That's also her view of Peter Dutton.
Yeah.
So I just think it's bizarre, this idea that if I don't like someone, I don't turn off the television or choose not to watch, they should not exist in the world.
The bigger issue here, the thing that people always get upset about Kitchen Cabinet, which is a show that has been rested for several years and has just come back, is that it's seen as giving politicians a soft ride. Now, that isn't what it is. If you watch it and if you're familiar with Annabelle Crabb's, phenomenal journalism, that's actually not what happens. But what it does do is it humanises them. That's the point. I want to ask you, Mia, that when we're in a particularly political moment, your inbox will be full of politicians who go, so for the last federal election, for example, I'd love to come on No Filter, Mia. Mm-hmm. I'd love for you to show Australia the other side of me. And sometimes you do political interviews and sometimes you don't. But one thing that you do if you do them is you're like, I'm not Lee Sales. That's what you always sort of say up front. This is not going to be an interrogation of policy. This is going to be a discussion about you as a human being, which is essentially what this is also about, Kitchen Cabinet. The people who hate it say that that is irrelevant and that we should not humanise politicians, particularly ones who we disagree with on various levels. What do you think about that? And how do you decide whether or not you're going to give your platform, in inverted commas, to somebody who may or may not have views that you know is going to upset a section of the audience?
I think it depends who they are and what influence they have over the world in which we live and the country in which we live. We have an ongoing invitation out to Peter Dutton to come on No Filter because he's the alternative Prime Minister.
Prime Minister has been on.
Yeah, the Prime Minister has been on.
Did you do Albo before or after he became Prime Minister?
I did it before he became Prime Minister, although he was on the Quickie last week. And I've interviewed Prime Ministers from both sides of politics. I've interviewed Josh Frydenberg when he was the Treasurer and the Deputy Prime Minister or the Deputy Leader of the Liberal Party. So, yeah, I've interviewed lots of politicians. I would argue that it's not about humanising them, it's about learning more about them. The very idea that people aren't human, I think, is a frightening one because once you start othering people and talking about them as being lizards who live in bins, they're the generalisations that racism is made up of and homophobia is made up of and transphobia and all of the discriminatory behaviours are about grouping an entire lot of people, giving them one characteristic. And so I think it's absolutely crucial that we know as much as we can about these people. And Hol, you've always said you find it insulting to think that you can watch Tony Abbott or Peter Dutton bake a cake or Barnaby Joyce and then have your mind changed by that.
That's my position. I mean, I really like Kitchen Cabinet and I've watched all 4 of the new season and every one of them has been fascinating in a different way. And of those 4 people, maybe one of them I'm quite closely politically aligned with, but the others all not, Every time what's interested me is it informs you of why they think the way they do. And I think that's really, really important. So the Peter Dutton episode, for example, and I mean, I politically concur with a lot of what Jan Fran is saying about Peter Dutton's track record in Parliament. I mean, the walking out of the apology and voting against safe sex. I mean, this is pretty far from where I sit. But it was fascinating because Annabel Crabb is a really skilled journo and she knows what she's doing. And she asked him questions about why he sees the world the way he does. And he spoke a lot about how he had a pretty blessed upbringing and then he became a police officer. And he said basically seeing the worst of people every day very much informed his political opinions and his worldview.
You know, I was a 19-year-old when I started policing and had a fairly sheltered life in retrospect. And I just hadn't been exposed to that side and the viciousness of some people, the depravity of others. And it's a small element of society, thank goodness, but it does stay with you because it jars and I think it scars as well.
Now, knowing that about him is really interesting, but knowing that about him does not make me go, oh, well then. That's
All is
why
forgiven.
you think that. Then that's fine. The most interesting part was really, she made a very good point, Annabel Crabb, that politicians get to see First Nations communities in a much more regular way than your average non-Indigenous Australian does. They tour Indigenous communities a lot. They go to all these corners of the nation. And she said, what have you learned about Indigenous culture through doing that? And he went immediately to a law and order question and talked about squalor and education and crime.
Well, it depends on where you go. If you go to East Arnhem Land, kids are at school 90% of the time. They've got an attendance rate equivalent to what we would see in a capital city. There's employment programs and a building company that has been established.
And she was like, well, that's very interesting that that's where you go when I ask you a question about culture. Now, that exchange was not combative. It was not a gotcha. I am really aware, of course, though, that there's some privilege innate in being able to say, oh, I want to learn more about these people and I want to understand why they think the way they think, if my skin is not literally in the game of what they're thinking about. And obviously some of those issues that Jan Fran's talking about and some of the issues that Peter Dutton and his party are talking about right now are so intensely personal and affecting to some parts of the community that I totally get that you wouldn't want to have dinner with the guy. And I think we insult people's intelligence if we say, well, we can't talk to these people who we disagree with intellectually because what if there's something that Peter Dutton says that I agree with him on? Maybe he likes coriander and I like coriander. Oh my God, does that mean I'm a terrible person? You know what I mean? Like, I'm not that stupid and nor is the population. But I'd love to know where we think the line is, Clare Stevens, smart woman that you are, because I do rankle at Trump being, you know, those arguments about in the 2016 election about whether he should have been going on Jimmy Fallon and whether we should be doing Holmes in Pauline Hanson's kitchen in the Woman's Weekly or whatever. Like, there are obviously times in which that line is blurry.
But hang on a second. Who gets to decide? Because the people who are saying no platform, don't interview, it's people generally on the left who say it when people on the right are interviewed. Sarah Ferguson got it when she interviewed Steve Bannon, who was, I think, chief of staff for Donald Trump, who was at that time the president for Four Corners, and people attacked her and said she shouldn't interview him. The people on the left who are saying no are always fine when it's their people who are being interviewed. It's so hypocritical, I think.
I think the thing about Kitchen Cabinet that I sort of haven't been able to get my head around is that the people Annabel Crabb is spending time with, they're democratically elected. They're elected by the audience that is watching the show. She's not going around and picking a terrible person and putting them on television and asking them what their favourite food is. Like, and if we believe in democracy, then I don't understand what the problem is with this show. I do think that a lot of us have a visceral reaction to seeing people who we know are doing very, very bad things portrayed in a lighter entertainment sense.
When you say bad things, can we clarify things that you disagree with? Because subjectively, politicians, they're elected representatives and they're part of a political system. So they're not, it's not like they're criminals. They're doing some things and they've got some positions that you might not agree with. I don't mean you personally, Claire, but you know, but like A lot of people said the same thing about when Scott Morrison was on 60 Minutes during last election campaign playing his ukulele and having a barbecue with his family.
Yeah, Ashley, you didn't like that,
and
Claire
you know,
Stevens.
It's not that I thought
he
it
was
shouldn't
our
have
elected
aired.
leader.
I thought it was funny to recap.
You
And
did
so I
a
did
very
that.
good job of that.
See, that's interesting, Mia, because I do think that's an interesting perspective to have in the present. But I think if we look at history, there will be political leaders who you look back on and think, you did a horrible, horrible thing. And I do think when you're passionate and you have connections to certain communities and you look at, especially in Australia and especially at the moment, if you look at some of our politicians and you look at some of the things they are doing, and it is really hard to grapple with the historical consequences of what they're doing. And the fact that, I mean, interesting that we're talking about politicians, some of the most evil people who have had the biggest consequences on humanity in the last few hundreds of years are politicians.
Of course,
I
they're making
understand.
general decisions that affect
And
principal
retroactively, you would look at some of them and think, dear God,
No,
you'd
no,
hate to have
I
given them a fluff platform.
But hang on a second. Like Prince Harry copped it when it was revealed that one of his pitches for Spotify was him interviewing sort of controversial leaders like Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin and asking them about their childhood. Now, if you got an opportunity to interview Vladimir Putin, of course you'd take it.
And I think that's where my tension lies, because on the one hand, if somebody was going to sit with Putin,
It shouldn't be Prince Harry.
it shouldn't be Prince Harry. Two, you would hope that you wouldn't be talking to him about his favourite music. You would hope that you would put some serious questions to him. However, when we look at history and how we study the cult of personality, you do study who a person was and how they grew up and why they turned out the way that they were.
Yeah.
Like, I think, they say journalism is the first draft of history. What Annabelle Crabb is doing is an incredibly important part of journalism, which is, who are these people? Where did they come from? Where did their beliefs come from? And I'm exactly with you, Holly, that simply knowing why a person thinks the way that they think does not mean I agree with them. I looked at Peter Dutton and thought, the fact that your views are shaped by your time in the police force says a lot about why our views are different. I get the tension that Jan Fran is kind of talking about. She also, just to give some context, she did say she didn't know what the solution was, but she wasn't comfortable with the idea of humanising Peter Dutton. I have to say that Annabelle Crabb and her level of journalism is not something to be scoffed at. She is incredibly intelligent. She knows exactly what she's doing.
And also the thing is the solution is that there are other shows, even on the same network, that do exactly what we're demanding, which is rigorous interrogation of policy from politicians. 7:30, for example, is a really good example of that. But the other important piece here is that I think that the idea of humanising politicians is more important than we think, because we really want the best and brightest to be the people who are leading our country, right? From a really diverse range of life. And who on earth would you recommend at the moment to become a politician? Like, who would you go, that seems like a great career. Off you go do that, particularly if they're female, particularly if they're from a minority. You would say, why would you put yourself through that? And anything that paints a picture of people beyond the stuffy shoulder pads and the marching around Parliament House. And I think it's really important because also we want people to want to lead. The idea that if you're going to put your hand up for that job, you are immediately going to be seen as one of the worst people in the world is actually a terrible thing. And we want people to want to lead. So I'm all here for the eating the soup with the people I don't agree with.
I think a theme of this episode, carrying on from Danny Masterson, is people with shit views, or even people who do shit things, aren't monsters, they're humans. And that's the scariest part. They don't have scales and they're not, you can't tell. And I think we have to believe that we're smart enough in a democratic society to make decisions that grapple with that tension. I have a recommendation. So over the weekend, I went to the movies to see Past Lives. It's from debut feature writer and director Celine Song, and it has been getting rave reviews. I've had it recommended to me by so many people.
Same, 10 out of 10 I've heard.
Yes, that I actually physically went to the movies, which was great.
There's a word in Korean, inyeon. It means providence or fate.
Do you believe in that?
That's just something Koreans say to seduce someone.
What a good story this is. Childhood sweethearts who reconnect 20 years later and realize they were meant for each other. In the story, I would be the evil white American husband standing in the way of destiny.
Shut up.
It has been labelled one of the best films of the year. It'll definitely win all the awards. And it follows the story of Nora and Hae Sung, two deeply connected childhood friends who are pulled apart when Nora's family immigrates from South Korea to Canada. And it sort of follows their lives in 12-year stints. So they're 12 in South Korea and she moves away. They reconnect at 24 via social media. And then at 36, they reconnect again and spend a week together in New York, where she now lives. And they confront ideas like destiny and love and the choices that make a life. And it is such a clever story about what it's like to immigrate and the life that you leave behind. It totally made me think differently about culture and cultural differences and what it is like to go to another part of the world and by necessity have to cut off how it was that you grew up and the person that you were. You have to leave that behind. So the main character, Nora, is played by Greta Lee. When she speaks Korean and when she speaks English, and she's got an American accent, it's like she's two different people.
Oh, wow.
And her partner comments in it that she dreams in Korean and that there's a part of her he feels like he'll never be able to access or understand because of that. Like, you dream in a language I can't speak. It is the most beautiful
Gorgeous,
film. Teo Yu plays Hae Sung. I just guarantee, go to the movies and see it. You'll be thinking about it for days and days afterwards.
And if you can't get to the movies, but you want more content and you want a bit more of us, I spoke about shopping addiction on our Subs episode last week. There's a link to that in the show notes.
Thank you for listening to Australia's #1 news and pop culture show. This episode was produced by Emeline Gazilas. The assistant producer is Tahli Blackman, with audio production by Leah Porges. We'll see you tomorrow.
Bye.
Bye. Shout out to any Mamamia subscribers listening. If you love the show and want to support us as well, subscribing to Mamamia is the very best way to do so. There is a link in the episode description.